resounding response.
Good morning.
Thank you. I was like, dang, I'm like my students. You ask them a question and they all give you a blank stare. Never very fun. So my most important question is, can you hear me if I don't use the mic?
I can hear you. Absolutely.
Awesome, because I need that.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to stand back there if I don't have to. Because I brought my clicker, so I don't have to do anything there. But thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it, as always. But it's nice to be here in person, to get out of Ohio and come down here to a little bit of warm weather for a couple days. Though I walked out this morning and I thought, oh my God, it's hot and humid already. By Monday, it's supposed to be back in the 30s in Ohio. So I was like, awesome. But anyways, so what I do, I'm a history professor. My areas of expertise and research are on the Negro Leagues, black baseball, and women's baseball. That's, the IWBC stands for the International Women's Baseball Center. We are in the process of building a museum in Rockford, Illinois, right across the street from historic Fire Stadium where the Rockford Peaches actually played. We own that property, and so we're in the process right now of raising a very large sum of money, $28.3 million, to do what we are hoping to do. So if you know people with big pockets, we're always interested in chatting with them. But today what I wanted to talk a little bit about was black baseball in the 19th century, a topic that most people don't know a great deal about. Typically, when you think about the Negro Leagues, people know Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, all of that, right? But black baseball in the 19th century, a really different topic. And if this fascinates you, I will tell you that the best book you can look at for this topic is James Brunson's 2-volume work on black baseball in the 19th century. He goes through and names every team you could possibly find in every state, including, as you'll see, the ones that were playing here in Florida. I thought it would be good to include those. And so that's a book to take a look at. But when you think about black baseball in the 19th century, our primary resource for all of this is this book, History of Colored Baseball, written by Saul White. Saul White, born in Bel Air, Ohio, as you can see, Hall of Famer, elected in 2006, both because of his play on the field, but more importantly, because of his book. He is considered to be the historian of black baseball. He wrote The History of Colored Baseball, and it came out just after the turn of the last century. And it was a look back at what had happened in the 19th century, because at the time, people used the excuse and said, well, the reason there are no blacks is because nobody plays. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. There are over 300 ball players, and there were over 70 teams playing that he knew about, and so he proceeded to lay that out for everybody. So that's our beginning resource, and still, 110, 115 years later, it's one of the best books you're going to find. This is obviously a reprint of that particular book, but you can't find it in its original still occasionally. There are a few copies of it out there about. I happen to have one of them, which is pretty cool. But Saul White is really our historian, and so from Saul White's work, we learn about the different ways that blacks participated in the game. And I say that because what we find are there are going to be individual black teams, there are going to be individual players who play on white teams, and there are going to be some attempts at league play. None of them succeed, not surprisingly, in the 19th century. We won't see an actual league, right, until the Negro Leagues in 1920. But there are numerous attempts before that, 2 in the 19th century, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And so he lays all of that out for us. So obviously, I'm not going to walk you through hundreds and hundreds of black baseball teams. So organized it a little bit by looking at a few of the teams, a few of the players, and the 2 leagues. And then I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. This particular bronze picture here is a picture of one of the very first teams that played. This is, you can sort of see it up on the top corner, but this is the Pittsburgh Pistons. And they are considered one of the very first organized black baseball teams in the Philadelphia area in the 1860s, so right after the Civil War, as baseball begins to expand across the country. And the Pythians, of course, named for the social club they belonged to, as was typical of a lot of teams at the time. They were part of social clubs, and that was not unique to white folk. That was also true. The Pythians are important to black baseball history for 2 reasons, I think. First of all, just the timing. But secondly, because they were so good that in the Philadelphia area, they were considered by some to be the best baseball team in the area, black or white. Others, certainly the best black baseball team. And one of the founders of the team is a gentleman by the name of Octavius Catto, who, if you know black history, was a major civil rights activist in the 19th century, working before the passage of the 13th through 15th Amendments to try to get voting rights for blacks. Unfortunately, the team only lasts until his death in 1871, when he is murdered, shot outside of a voting booth when he is trying to advocate for that. The Pythians, because of how good they are, they're actually going to apply for membership in the National Association of Professional Baseball Clubs in 1867. And of course get denied. That shouldn't surprise anybody. And the reason for the denial is the only time it's ever actually written down that it's because they're black. All the other references that we have to a color line, all of that, are purely the gentleman's agreement, a handshake, a discussion. This is the only time for 1 year that it was actually written down and it said they were not going to be granted membership, no team, as long as they had a single player with a single drop of Negro blood. They were not going to be allowed membership. Following year, that is taken out of and it just becomes practice, as opposed to actually being written down. Yeah.
So they were still playing New York rules. They didn't have, Massachusetts rules. They were playing the New York.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And so when they applied, they are going to be denied. And so their time frame is 1865 to 71. Octavius Catto, Jacob White, and another gentleman by the name of Walter Still are the three founders of the team. They played on the largest stadium in Philadelphia, where all of the white teams played. Some have also argued that part of the reason they didn't get accepted was because no white team wanted to actually be beaten by them in an official championship, which likely to have, since they beat them regularly just playing. And so that plays an element as well. Their very first game was played in October of 1866, and they lost, and yes, the score is correct, 70-15 to the Bachelor Club out of Albany, New York, and go on then to play for a number of years. And their record obviously improves from that first. As you guys know better than I do, that is not an atypical score for a game in the 19th century, right? Had a lot to do with the fields, the play, style of play, etc. And so, but it always surprises my students because they think, that's a football score. And I'm like, no, that's a baseball game. It's okay. It's baseball, very different from today. They are also played in what is considered to be the first recorded interracial game, white and black playing together, in 1869 versus the Olympics. And again, they did lose that game, closer score in this particular case. But as I say, inside Philadelphia, within the league play, we don't have a full record of there, but they won over 70% of the games that they played. So that lends credence to the idea that maybe white teams didn't want to play against them officially. And then, as I mentioned, Catto was murdered in October of 1871, and that really puts an end to the team at that point because he was the guiding force behind the Pythians. But the Pythians set the stage for all the other teams that are going to come along. They showed the opportunities, the success, that there was no reason that blacks couldn't play baseball. There's not, right, except for the color of their skin. And there's the box score for the Pythian Olympic game, and Catto is there. Right there, playing second base. Typical box score doesn't give you a whole lot of detail, but at least they're there. One of the other early individuals that you have to talk about, and knew you would appreciate that, but I heard from Cooperstown, is his real name is John W. Jackson, but he is known historically as Bud Fowler. Changed his name, and nobody's entirely 100% sure why. People like to speculate, and some of that speculation, that's purely all it is, because I've read so many explanations, and most of them steer towards bad reasons why he changed his name, right? That he was trying to escape the law, blah, blah, blah. There is no evidence to any of that. What it probably has to do with is he it is suggested by at least a couple of individuals that this was a better name, and particularly the bug idea for playing baseball. Regardless, he is important because he is the first professional black baseball player that we recognize, and he played in 1878. In his first game, they played, and he will play almost entirely, not totally, but a good portion of his career where we played on white teams, and so he has the experience of having to deal with, though later on he will also be one of the founders of one of the most famous black teams of the 19th century, the Page Fence Giants, up in Michigan, so we know he's had some Michigan folk in the time. So Fowler, and of course Fowler just got elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame this past election season, and there is a street named for him now in Cooperstown, since that is the general area of where he is from. And so Fowler is a good representative. So when you read about Fowler, you get to read about some of the struggles they had, and everything from how do you travel, where do you stay, all of those kinds of discussions. But Fowler loved to play, and so he played pretty much all over the Midwest and the Northeast. He did not go south, he did not go out to the west. That unique characteristic is John Donaldson, who played pretty much everywhere across the country. Fowler pretty much stayed Midwest and Northeast, where most of the teams were, the cities, the opportunities. When we talk about black baseball in the 19th century, a question that always comes up, so we have the first team, we have the first professional ball player, but who's the first to play in the major leagues? And usually when I ask my students that, they'll say Babe Ruth or some crazy person like that. Or maybe they think Jackie Robinson, but hopefully everybody in this room knows that that's not a correct answer either. Normally the answer given is Fleetwood Walker and his brother Weldy Walker. That is also not actually accurate any longer, hasn't been for over 10 years. This gentleman here, where the arrow was pointing to them, that is William Edward White, ironically. William Edward White is actually the first to play on a major league ball team. He played for the Providence Grays in 1879. One game, but he is listed on the roster. He is there for the whole game. He gets 3 outs, 1 base hit. And so the Providence Grays at the time were a part of the American Association, which was considered a major league. It's the same one that Walker and his brother are both going to play in almost a decade later. And so William Edward White, for a long time, was not recognized. Nobody knew about him, partly because of his name, right? Immediately thinking, but also, and I know you can't, I don't know how well you can see the picture, but black and white picture, he's very light-skinned, almost impossible to tell. And so it's census records that give us that indication. And so it's apparent that he was able to pass for white, even though he was not. And so what this suggests, of course, is if he exists, there are probably others that are. And so I always say now, these guys are all one of the first to play, rather, because you always get in trouble when you say the first, because somebody's immediately going to tell you there's somebody else, right? But he is. Certainly, Walker is also one of those, and Walker had a longer career, no doubt about it. Williams, we've only found him that one game for 1 day, and probably because someone found out is likely what happened, and so he had to move on and play elsewhere or change his name to play, which often happened. And so, but he is considered our first.
I don't know if this is true, but I read somewhere that he had a choice between black and white to choose for his color. He chose white because he could to get the...
We don't know if that, we do know that he checked that box. Whether he did that by a conscious choice, whether that was a family pressure, or just the realization that that was going to get him farther, right? So but he did check, we do know that he checked that box on the census, on at least one. There are others where he is listed as black. So the question, and that's how we were able to, Peter Morris, a great researcher, tracked this all down and was able to figure out that this, yeah, it's Peter Morris. I'm sure that's probably where, because Peter's the one that figured this out. There are lots and lots of early players. I just put a few up here for you to see, and I chose this picture because it's a really fascinating one. That is Prince Honeycutt out of Fergus Falls, Minnesota, playing on a white team in 1872, integrated team. But you will notice by this picture, what's his profession?
Shopkeeper.
He's actually not.
Barber.
He's a barber. I heard something. So the most common thing for black ball players by profession outside of baseball, because that wasn't really was to be either a waiter or a barber. They were considered to be somebody with a higher class status in the black community. They made money, they often owned their own property, etc. They had the ability to travel, and so many of them were ball players, barbers, or waiters. And so those are the most common. So Prince Honeycutt and his father, before him, owned this barbershop in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and was able to play. Others, and obviously this is I just picked a few to show you some of the names. You'll see the Walker brothers up there at the bottom of the list. That's Fleetwood Walker and his brother Welby. Fleet is the catcher, Welby's the outfielder. Fleet had a good baseball career, not only in the major leagues, but also just in general. He played in college at Oberlin and the University of Michigan, where he went to law school, because Oberlin was one of the first to allow blacks to attend. Michigan clearly did as well, because he's there in law school. He also wrote a book, and then went home after he gave up on baseball, back to Southern Ohio, and took over his father's barbershop. And so a very common refrain that you see. Walker, at one point, his credited average for his career is 254, and you think, that's pretty decent as a catcher. But it takes on even greater significance when you realize he's a catcher who most of the time was playing with all white players, meaning his pitcher is white, who does not like the fact that he is a black catcher, who does not pay attention to anything that Walker wants to do. And so when you look at pictures of Walker, the most amazing thing to see, not uncommon for catchers, right, is it's very clear that every single finger on his hand has been broken more than once. And so you add that into the picture. He eventually gives up on because he basically says, and that's the point of his book that he writes, that America was never going to change, so why stay? They should all go back to Africa. And so he was part of that promotion because he didn't believe we would ever change. And so he gave up eventually on the idea of continuing to try to play baseball. Frank Grant, I mentioned up here, he plays for a number of black teams and white teams over the course of his career. He is one who also has been elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame among the 37 that have been. He was elected in 2006, second baseman and pitcher. George Stovey, Bob Bailey will probably maybe talk about him later when he's talking about overlooked legends of the 19th century. He qualifies certainly there. Stovey was one of the pitchers where we get the stories about Cap Anson and Cap Anson refusing to allow his team on the field with black players. The pitcher that he was most upset about having to play against was George Stovey. And he didn't want to put his team on the field with a black pitcher that was going to beat his team. And so Stovey is the individual that you usually read about. And then John Donaldson, probably the most traveled ball player, certainly on the side of black ball players in the 19th and early 20th century, where I said that Fowler played in the Midwest, Northeast. Donaldson pitched, played the outfield, pretty much anywhere across the country. We tried to put together a map of all the places he played, and it does. And it covers some of Latin America as well. There's been a long time campaign to get Donaldson into the Hall of Fame. The difficulty for him, and any of the black ball players in particular of the 19th century, is the lack of statistics. Because they are playing against a variety of competition. Amateur ball players, independent teams, college teams, high school teams. So how do you rate the quality of, because he's credited, we have all the box scores in, with over 4,000 strikeouts, over 400 wins, etc. But the competition is the question. And so Donaldson, really interesting character to read about, and considered to be sort of he and Bud Fowler, the big promoters of black baseball all across the country. Very popular player. When you read the newspaper accounts, fans loved him, towns loved when he was coming into town. He always gets big publicity. And so just a few examples of some of those early 19th century ball players. I put up these two short pieces from the newspaper just to show you a little bit about the difficulty of researching. Because here are two accounts. The top one is from the Democrat Advocate out of Michigan in 1894. The colored baseballists of Westminster have organized a club called the Westminster Greys. They will play a club at Gettysburg on June 12th. So they were heading to Pennsylvania, right? But there's no follow-up. No indication of where this team came from, who they are, no other articles. So that's all you have. So we know they existed. Can we say they actually played the game? Not by any evidence, right? The second one says the West End Colored Baseball Club, who were defeated by the Shamrock last Sunday, are not satisfied and wish to arrange another game with the Shamrocks. They have posted a forfeit with Mr. John C. Myers for another game next Sunday afternoon. Again, we don't have any record of the game that was supposedly played that they lost, or whether they get taken up on their challenge. There's no indication of any of the players, right? That's all we have. And there is, so far, no fun. And that is the most common way we find black ball teams in the 19th century. Usually listed as either colored, Negro, darkies, black, right? All of those, and that's pretty much how you find them. Unfortunately, doesn't give us a lot to go on in terms of that idea. But the book I mentioned to you earlier, James Brunson's book, he lists every single one of these teams that we could possibly have been able to find, at least to say, here they are, go out and see if you can find more. So it's always a good challenge for us as researchers to think about that idea. Another example, this is a team picture that was found in Connecticut from the 1880s. Not a single player has been identified. We do not know where this was taken. We simply know that it is a black baseball team, or at least they are posing as a black baseball team, because there's a guy here in the back. And somewhere in there, there's a guy, I can't remember where, there's a guy with a ball as well. But that's all you've got. So think about those newspaper articles, think about pictures like this, right? Until we can figure out who one or more of the players are, how do you track down who the team is, right? And so, sadly, this is sometimes all we have in terms of the materials and ability to research. I thought it would be interesting for those of you, since we're here in Florida, to show you, and these come directly from James Brunson's book, the teams that are identified from the 19th century black ball teams here in Florida, where there is more than one article about them. So we have a little bit more detail. And you can see the earliest there in the 1870s and 80s. So we've got Jacksonville, Tampa, Jacksonville, Pensacola, and St. Augustine. And of course, the St. Augustine team, the Ponce de Leon Hotel Club, waiters again, right? That team, Frank Thompson and S.K. Govern, are going to be the individuals who are responsible for the creation of the Cuban Giants. And the Cuban Giants in 1885 are the first officially recognized full professional black baseball team, playing out of Babylon, Long Island. Again, another hotel. And so they are hired to play baseball, and then they are waiters at the hotel to take care of. And so Thompson and Govern are, and so a lot of the players who played on the Ponce de Leon team follow them up to Long Island and create the Cuban Giants. The start of Cuban Giants, Cuban X-Giants, the original Cuban Giants, there's a whole variety of variation, all different teams, all using that same, and everybody always asks, well, why the Cuban Giants? Why call them that? Well, the Giants, obviously, because so many white teams were called that, then if you put that in the paper, and sometimes you didn't fully identify, you might get fans who come out to see you simply because they think something about your team. The second idea, and this gets a lot of play in literature and things as to why they chose Cuban, and the primary reason is simply to indicate that they were not American black. It was okay to be Cuban black, somebody outside of the country. The story that gets a little overdone is the idea that they were out there on the field shouting in gibberish to make people think they were speaking Spanish. There is no evidence to actually suggest that that happened, but I read that over and over again. And that's just a reinforcement of that idea that they were doing whatever was necessary. But simply calling yourself that, again, to a fan reading, hearing about, and they might come to see you play, whereas if you recall the Black Giants, they might not come, and that was the simple reason. So Frank Thompson and S.K. Govern are credited with starting that team. And that is, as I said, 1885, which is the beginnings, because by that point we have reached the gentleman's agreement is pretty much not fully in place, but it is in the process. 1886 is usually credited as the official start of the gentleman's agreement to keep blacks out of the major leagues. So this is around that same time period. If you think about American history, This is after the end of Reconstruction, and things have started to shift to more and more separation and segregation. And so not surprisingly, we start seeing less and less of blacks on white teams and black teams playing white teams. Instead, they're starting to form more of their own so they have somebody to play against. And that will just increase as we move into the 1890s. So hence you see that most of these are 1890s teams. That's why. Okay? Because prior to that, they were probably playing on integrated teams against, but as the country solidifies its racial segregation, this is what happens.
Can we make the assumption that they were playing by the rules of like the Spalding guy?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We have records of them, their purchase orders of bats and balls that they're buying from, and all of those things. So yes, they were playing. And that's an interesting question, because often people, even in the 20th century, will ask that they weren't playing the same. Yes, they were playing the same rules. They bought the same equipment. They just happened to play against one another instead of against white ball teams. And so that's what you have. So those are some of the Florida teams from the 19th century. Following along, I just picked another place to show you, again, that connection. Hot Springs, Arkansas, not a place you necessarily think for this, but Hot Springs, Arkansas, starting in the 1890s, once again, is going to be a place for black baseball teams to both form and to come and play. Again, because you have the spas and you have all the hotels, and you have lots of people to entertain there. That's going to remain true through the mid-20th century. There are lots of, so Homestead Grays, Pittsburgh Crawford, some of these teams all find their way to Hot Springs, Arkansas to play. And so these are just some of the, and I mentioned the Hot Spring Arlingtons right at the turn of the century because Rube Foster, who goes on to form the first official Negro National League, pitched against the Hot Spring Arlingtons in 1901 successfully for he was at that time playing with the Philadelphia Giants, and so it's two black teams playing in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Again, many of the players on the Hot Springs teams are waiters at the hotels there again, so reinforcing that continued theme throughout when we talk about black baseball. Some of you may remember, if you saw my presentation a few years ago here, mentioning a women's team from the 19th century, a black women's team called the Dolly Vardens. They played in 1883 and 1884 in Philadelphia. There were actually two Dolly Varden teams. They were simply called Dolly Varden 1 and Dolly Varden 2. And then there was a third women's black baseball team, also in Philadelphia, at the same time, called the Captain Jakes. And so they tended to play one another. Unfortunately, we don't know a great deal about them. There are about 6 articles about the Dolly Vardens, and then one of the articles gets repeated over and over and over again, and it's the main article. It's about this long, and all it talks about is how they dressed, what their uniforms looked like, what color they were, and how bad they were at playing baseball. And it makes fun of them as being a serious kind of, and so unfortunately, that is most people's impression, not an accurate one. There is now a children's book out, simply called The Dolly Vardens, and it's beautifully illustrated because she took that article and the beautiful color and the illustrator did a marvelous job. It's really for, if you have grandkids or anything, it's probably kindergarten through 2nd grade, but it's a beautiful rendition. Unfortunately, there are no existing official photographs from that time period of the Dolly Vardens. And I say that because if you read in a lot of books, you will see repeated over and over again, a mistake. A team that gets listed as the Dolly Vardens, it's a 1920s Phyllis Wheatley YWCA baseball team. So it's 40 years after this. But I've seen it, if I've seen it once, I've seen it 10 times. That is the Dolly Vardens, and no, it is not. So if you see that, you can correct people. There is no, I wish there was, but there is no existing picture of them. We do have a list of their roster, though, because they did actually tell us. But the roster says, for our captain, we have her first and last name, but everybody else, it says Miss Harris, and Miss Jones, and Miss, how helpful is that to try to research, right? When you don't even have a first name, all you have is a last name, or you have Mrs. somebody, and it's her husband's name, and it's not hers. So, difficult, but they did exist. 1883, 1884, playing in the Philadelphia area. And so kind of a unique aspect of black baseball in the 19th century. This is the Cuban Giants team. that I mentioned to you earlier. This is the original. This was in 1886, a year after they were founded. And so this is their team. By this point, having moved out of Long Island, you'll notice on the picture it says Trenton, New Jersey, as that is where they called home after their first year. And for a long time, people didn't realize that Babylon, Long Island was where they started. They thought it was Trenton, but it is actually in Long Island.
That's the St. Augustine, Florida?
Yes,
Trenton,
because that's the Ponce de Leon team that moved
Okay.
up to. So, because it's Frank Thompson and S.K. Govern who are going to take the team.
Most of the same players, do you think they
Yes,
have? Yeah.
over half the team, I think 3/4 of the team in that first year were the same individuals. Based on roster, they are the same folk. They start to change after they've been up, and they want to keep a Ponce de Leon team playing as well. So they end up with two versions of them. This is what the Cuban Giants become as they start to change names and move forward. They here are called as you can see, this is the York Giants, or the Monroe Giants. In 1890, they joined the Interstate Baseball League as a part of opportunity to play against white teams. This will be one of the last, not the last, but one of the last times that you will see an integrated league. So this is 1890. So when I mentioned to you the idea that the Gentleman's Agreement, we credited 1886, right? There are integrated teams and integrated leagues still playing through the early 1890s. And that's your owner right there, James Kriker, who puts together, and they basically, it's the same Cuban Giants, they simply changed their name to enter the league, and so they play for half a season in the Eastern Interstate League in 1890. And there's Saul White with the arrow. So I mentioned him earlier as a writer, but also a ball player. So that he is one of the more well-known players. The probably best hitter on the team is Arthur Thomas, the catcher, who supposedly the year before in non-league play, because they didn't have a league, was considered to be the best hitting catcher in all of baseball at that time. And again, you could say, what's that based on? In the 19th century, you didn't have to have anything. You could just declare yourselves champions. You could declare yourself the best of, because it's great publicity to put in the newspaper, right? And so it wasn't necessarily based on any real fact, but he is considered to be, supposedly, according to one newspaper article, in 1889, Thomas hit .379 as catcher. And so you think about that. But that's the claim. So they played in the Interstate League. There was also, they were so popular, here's a piece of sheet music, a polka that was written in 1888 by Dr. T.E. Townsend about the Cuban Giants that led to them being part of a vaudeville-style show in New York. Minstrel shows and baseball have a huge connection, and so not a surprise. But he wrote this about the Cuban Giants. This sits in the collection at the Library of Congress. I've never heard it played. It's kind of goofy, but it was part of the minstrel show. So the Cuban Giants here in 1888. This picture, famous picture, many people are familiar with it, have seen it before. This is the Page Fence Giants. And so I mentioned Bud Fowler is going to go on to help found the Page Fence Giants in the 1890s in Ada, Michigan, where the Page Fence Company was located. Page Fence Company decides to sponsor this ball team because it's great advertisement for them. Because two things are going to happen. And you can sort of see it in the picture. It's not the greatest picture, but you can see the fencing. They carried their fencing with them and rolled it out. And of course, on the fencing would say the name of the company. So, great way to advertise your company as the ball team travels all over the place. Probably one of their most famous players, George Wilson, up there identified, infielder on the team, who was considered between 1893 and 1896 to be one of the best fielding second basemen that you found. He also did some pitching and was known for not his power but his speed, and so he's probably one of the better known players. By this point, Fowler is playing, but he did a lot more of the player managing, simply because he's been around. This is 20 years into his career, which started in the goes back to 1872, and here we are, 1893. And so, John Donaldson pitched against the Page Fence Giants. Don't believe he ever played, except for 1 year, on the Page Fence Giants. Most of the time he was playing, because he found that he could make more money if he was independent, and he just traveled and took the highest salary he could get from different teams. And he was often the highest paid player, white or black, on the teams that he going again to his skill and popularity. And so they were inducted into the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame in 2021, and this is the plaque. It says, based in Adrian, sponsored by the Page Woven Wire Fence Company, founded by a group, Grant Home Run Johnson, Bud Fowler, former Mayor Len Hawk, brothers Howard and Rolla Taylor, Page Fence Giants, 1895 to 1898. Midwest and Canada, over 100 games a year. And it says, in 1896, the Page Fence Giants defeated the Cuban X-Giants, version of that, or in a series regarded as determining the best black baseball team of the era. They won 87% of their games during the 4 years they were in existence. And that is all supported by box scores that we do have. And so when we say there are no statistics, or people say that, that's not true. And so it's just a matter of how those are put together. And so the Page Fence Giants, a fascinating team to read about. And there are just another picture of the Page Fence Giants, advertisement for them playing in Indianapolis, and the other piece that was important about them in the bottom picture, of course, is how they traveled, which is why they were so successful. The company bought them their own railroad car, which also became a way to advertise, because it said they put Page Fence Giants on the front and the side of the railroad car. And of course, that got around the restriction that develops in the 1890s because of Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal. And of course, we use Plessy versus Ferguson ultimately to talk about all separate but equal, but the actual court case was about travel and train cars. And so having your own train car gets around how do you travel? How do you pay for it, right? And so they had their own, and that made them pretty unique. So the Page Fence Company clearly put a great deal of money into expecting to get back, which they did, right? Lots of advertising, because you have their name on the uniform, on the fence, and now on the railroad car as well. Did you have a question?
Yeah, this was how many years after Bud Fowler played for him?
This is Bud is still there. This is, but he wasn't playing by this point.
Okay.
But he is still a part of. Bud played in the first year for them, and then after that was served more on the promotion side and occasionally on the managerial side of things. And so that's why you don't see his name there at that point. The last opportunity for a black team to play in a white league comes in 1898 in what was known as the Iron and Oil League. Half a season, team played, had an 8-4-1 record. They were called the Acme-Colored Giants. And the two primary players on this team that were important, Walter Williams, mentioned in the article, is the premier pitcher. Ultimately won 6 of those 8 games that they won. And I mentioned Dave Wyatt because if you are familiar with black baseball history, Dave Wyatt is a player on this team in 1898. But in 1920, when the Negro National League is formed, he is one of the journalists invited to Kansas City at that very first meeting to talk about the creation of the league, to help decide on the teams that are going to be a part of it, and the distribution of the players. And so Wyatt is very much responsible for that the very first creation of the Negro National League, so in 1920. Here he is as a young ball player, 19, 20 years old, and later goes on to become a journalist, and that is his contribution. So this is the last. So we start with the Pythians in 1866, and here we are in 1898. Last time we're going to see a black team in a white league. So as we turn into the 20th century, that all disappears. And so this is the last opportunity. Mentioned to you that there are 2 leagues, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about both of them. This is the one that almost never gets talked about, because the second one people are a little more familiar with. 1886, and I think what makes this incredibly unique and interesting is it's the Southern League. So in the South, here's an attempt to create a black baseball league in 1886. It doesn't get off the ground very far. None of them do, but they try. And there are the teams for you. So you've got Memphis, Atlanta, Savannah, 2 teams Charleston, Jacksonville, New Orleans, and so 3 teams from Jacksonville, a couple teams from New Orleans, Memphis, Atlanta, so you can see where they're playing and the opportunities that are there. It was going to be a pretty large league if all of them had joined, which they ultimately don't, but that was the idea. Here is one of the few articles we have about that. 1886, from New Orleans, it says, judging from the first game, the colored clubs will furnish good sport and the teams can play ball. The Eclipse boys all fielded well, threw the ball like the best professionals. Memphis club won the game 3-1, scoring all its runs in the first inning on missed third strikes. Wild throws by catchers and 2 passed balls. So, kind of interesting that they play ball well, and then all the runs are scored because of essentially pass balls, errors, etc. But this is often how there's an emphasis in a lot of the articles, a lot of the times by some of the reporters, to really emphasize they're good ball players, they're professionals, they're going to do the right thing, which you don't see them talking about white teams that way. Which is kind of fascinating. It's that overemphasis on. But we don't have many articles. We think that 3 games were played, and that was pretty much it before the league. And most of the time, when these leagues don't succeed, it's for a couple reasons. You can imagine most of them, right? They don't have stadiums to play in. It's hard to travel, right? They don't have places to eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the realization that because of all those things, most of these teams can make more money independently, right? Because when you're in a league, you have to pay a fee, you have to pay guarantee, all of those kind of things. And so for most of these teams, it makes much more sense to remain independent. So they give it a try, it doesn't work. Here are 2 other articles. So the Huntsville Gazette, April of 1886, a Southern League of Colored Baseball is being organized and will probably have clubs at Nashville, Memphis, Atlanta, New Orleans, Savannah, Mobile, and other southern cities. We should like to see the league succeed, so that's beforehand. A circular which is going around the head manager's offices of the Southern League states they represent a capital of $100,000, will play a series of games simultaneous in Memphis, Atlanta, Augusta, Charleston, Montgomery, Savannah, and Jacksonville on or about the 10th of May. And that is when they were supposed to start in May, they end up sort of getting rolling until June, and then they're gone. But there was great interest in the idea, doesn't really succeed. Following year, one more attempt, the League of Colored Baseball Clubs in 1887. This is the more famous, usually talked about as the first attempt at a league. And there are your entrants. Salary range for the players, $10 to $75. That's a lot of money in the 19th century for anybody. 75 would be your pitcher and catcher, everybody else in the lesser. And you can see all of these are Midwestern, Northeastern cities for the most part. They didn't really put together a schedule of more than 15 games originally. They wanted to leave as many open dates for people to play as they wanted to make money. There was a guarantee for visitors and for rainouts to try to make sure that money was flowing in. The league lasts 1 week and will also fail. And so that's why you don't usually hear about, and there will be then 4 more attempts before 1920, all of the 20th century, and none of those will succeed either. And so here it is. They opened on May 6th in a game between the Gorhams of New York and the Keystones of Pittsburgh. There was a grand street parade and a brass band concert. The game was well contested. The Gorhams won 11-8, and 1,200 people were present. Pretty significant, and so it's kind of amazing that they didn't succeed. But again, it goes to that, where are you making your money, how do you make your money, and what's better? Do you have to pay that guarantee, or do you get to keep it all yourself? And that's what it came down to. And so there is the record that we have for the league. So last of the week they played, and you can see so the top team only played 1 game, and others played 10. And that is not unusual in Negro League black baseball history either. Again, rainouts, teams don't show up, whatever it might be in terms of the differences. And so there you have a discussion about, and like I said, just the tip of the iceberg, but wanted to give you a little bit of the different variety. And I realized we started late, so I tried to we're still under 10 o'clock, so if there's any other questions, I'm happy to take them from anybody that has any.
You mentioned earlier Kansas City, and I know they have a big museum.
Yes.
I also heard recently through a friend through a Zoom that Birmingham actually has.
They do. Birmingham has a Southern Negro League Museum, and so it covered what Birmingham does that Kansas City doesn't do. Is Birmingham is much more about the larger black baseball as opposed to just the Negro Leagues, which tends it's not the primary focus of Kansas City, but that tends to be. And then the Birmingham Museum, the vast majority of that collection came from one individual, Leighton Ravel, who is the founder of the museum. And he chose Birmingham because of the Negro Southern League, which lasts from 1920 to 1960. It's the only Negro League that lasts the entire 40-year existence, because the Negro National League goes out of existence. Second one comes back in, but the Negro Southern League is and so that's why the museum is in Birmingham. So there are actually 3 museums, because there's also one in Baltimore. A much smaller one, but there is one in Baltimore, mostly focused around the Baltimore teams and Leon Day, pitcher in the Hall of Fame as well.
So Saul White's
Yeah.
sort of the seminal book on 19th century black baseball. Is there any other books that focus on that?
So James Brunson's 2-volume work and then Todd Peterson has a book on black baseball in Minnesota from the 19th century, and they're really the premier works that are out there. Bill Plott wrote his on the Negro Southern League and black baseball in the South, so it does include some 19th century, but it's mostly a 20th century focus. And so it's always much harder when we consider we know this much about the Negro and we know this much about the 19th century.
Well, the follow-up question to that is one of the things that the Vintage Baseball Association wants to do is inclusivity. I mean, I would love to see, an all-black team, and have it harken back to that time, but it's touchy because it wasn't cool, back then. I mean, what was going on?
What you could do is there's clear evidence of integrated teams.
Yeah.
So that would be the better way to approach it, to avoid some of that feeling, would be to invite and try to create.
Which we do.
Right.
Sure.
But that would be supported by the history pretty easily, and avoid some of the other, because people today might take it wrong that you're and you certainly don't want that kind of publicity, even though that would be accurate historically. Yeah.
I know that the Baseball Hall of Fame is getting their new exhibit, because
Yes.
the other one's been there a long time. Did you work with them on
Yes,
that?
I've been one of the outside consultants for the last 2 years. There's 5 of us. It's been an incredible experience again to work with the Hall. And it is opening the last weekend of May.
I saw that, and you're going to be doing something virtual this month. Right?
Yes, I am. I'm going to be at the Hall of Fame again the end of the month, the last Friday of March. I'm doing a presentation on women in baseball for them, and it's going to be done virtually.
Oh, very nice.
Another question.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the documentary that Mark Duran's producing called Her Game is Hardball?
Yes, I just did a 3-hour interview with Mark.
Wonderful.
Just about 2 weeks.
Good.
It was going to start. We've been trying for a while, and it finally came to Kent. I thought it was going to be like an hour. It was 3.5 hours.
He visited our field and we had an all-women's game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be great when it comes out. Mark's been working on it for a long time,
Yes.
but it's getting close, and he's hoping to get the final funding to see that come out next year. Yeah.
Other than the Dolly Partons, was there much evidence of black women?
In the 19th century?
Yeah.
Yes. The current book that I'm finishing is on black women in baseball. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to correct, is the myth that they were not playing baseball either. It's much harder to find. I mean, it's hard to find women in general playing any sports in the 19th century. Black women, increasingly difficult. But I have evidence of a number of teams, a number of women beyond the Dolly Partons. They are still the first that I can find, 1883. But from that point forward, there are black women playing.
I think you may have covered it 2 years ago, but in general, women playing integrated with men during baseball
is rare. Is rare.
And it's mostly later in the 19th century?
Yeah, so in the evidence for that in the 19th century comes in the late 1898. With Leslie Arlington is really one of the first ones that is significantly recorded. There's evidence, again, sort of the short articles that say something's going to happen, but then do we know if it did or not? So how do you weigh that, right?
I bring it up because we have a lot of women that
Sure.
play, and I've always wanted the right words to use, because we want to let them play, but we want to
Absolutely.
explain what really would have happened.
Right, and so there is certainly evidence that was the case, particularly on non-professional teams. That we have more evidence of that idea than we certainly. Lizzie Arlington is the best example we have in the 19th century playing on a professional men's team, and she got a chance to play in a major league experience for one game.